My name is Steve Hinkley. I'm the president and CEO of the Adventure Science Center, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. David Aronoff. Dr. Aronoff is the head of the Division of Infectious Diseases with Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Dave, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you here and learn a little bit more about what's going on in the world of coronavirus, as well as now that the vaccine rollout is starting to hit a pretty good stride. But before we get there, I'd love to hear from your perspective. Help us understand the work that you do at Vanderbilt and what has this last year been like for you now that we're pretty much coming up on the 1-year anniversary of COVID in Tennessee.
Yeah. Well, I'm an infectious disease physician. I take care of adults mostly who have infections or suspected to have infectious diseases. I also do research and teach and do all the things that we're able to do at a big academic medical center. And I think I share the experience with a lot of people in infectious diseases, epidemiology, and public health that all of our jobs sort of phase shifted starting in early 2020. And for us in Tennessee, it was early March of 2020 where my focus had to pivot, as did a lot of my colleagues, into this pandemic.
So you've been on the front lines. You've really been sort of in the trenches, so to speak, in the fight against this, but also coming certainly in contact with people who have been personally affected by this. And what has that been like for the last year, really, to see it firsthand? You know, folks like myself have been very fortunate to kind of have a back seat to some of this stuff, but you've really been right up there. And what has that been like?
Well, I've not experienced anything like this in my lifetime, and it is very motivating to go out and talk to people about how to stay safe when every day I'm watching people suffer from a disease that we know how to prevent, yet is very difficult to prevent. And seeing families hospitalized at the same time, watching people struggle to exist, to require life support on a daily basis is difficult and also very motivating to try to continue to lean into this pandemic and do as much as I possibly can and as we possibly can to keep people safe. This has been a very nefarious pandemic or infectious disease because so many people who get infected don't get really sick. And it can be hard for people to understand that even though they feel well and the people around them aren't sick, that there are people who aren't faring as well when they get infected and end up in the hospital, end up dying of this infection. And having the privilege to participate in the care of patients suffering from COVID-19 is absolutely the reason why I wake up every day wanting to do what I can to stop it.
Yeah, well, we're thankful for everything that you've done. And certainly as a Nashvilleian, I feel like we've been well cared for by our community. I think the city has done a lot of great measures to keep us safe. And I know a lot of that's informed by the work that y'all are doing. So thank you very much for doing that. Yeah. The last conversation that I had with somebody from Vanderbilt University Medical Center was Dr. Alex Jahangir, who is also spearheading the coronavirus response task force here in Nashville. And one of the things that I asked him back in November was, we're starting to see a decline, but of course the holiday season is upon us now. Is now a time to sort of scale back in some of these preventative measures that we're taking, or do we really need to stay full throttle on the gas? And now here we are, almost 4 months later in that conversation, and the vaccine is starting to see some rollout. We now have a number of different vaccines that are being utilized against it. Is now the time to relax, or when does that happen?
So we're heading in the right direction. I think we should still be doing everything in our power, particularly the simple things, to keep disease transmission risk low. And I'm hopeful that then we can get to a point where we actually reach an all clear and we can be back doing the kinds of things we really enjoyed doing in the old days of 2019.
Yeah. So speaking of the vaccine, we had a few questions that we asked our public if they would be interested in knowing anything in particular from you. And one of the questions that came in from them was, some of the vaccines have 2 shots, and then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that's out now, I believe, is just a single dose. And so with the 2-shot variants, the Pfizer, Moderna, and maybe there are others, are the first and second shots different? And what is it that's so different about those 2 things?
Yeah, really good question. And I'm just so excited that we're actually in a position to have conversations about tell us about all these vaccines, right? That's amazing. So the two mRNA vaccines are ones that when you get the shot, the vaccine itself is pretty short-lived. It doesn't hang around long in our body. It stimulates an initial immune response, and we start to generate antibodies that will protect us from infection. But that initial response is not as strong as it could be. And we know that from the studies of these vaccines that if we come back several weeks later and give a booster shot, our immune system, which one of the features of the human immune system is it has memory, and if it sees something that it's already seen before, it creates an amplified response.
Right.
So in the case of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, it's the same exact shot that we get the first time that we get the second time. The dose is the same, the vaccine is identical each time, but our response is very different both times. The first time we make a somewhat mid-range response, we'll say. But with the booster shot, we get a very aggressive immune response that gives us really high levels of antibody, the kinds of levels that we think are even going to provide protection for some of these variants that are around, for which the vaccine wasn't initially designed. With the single dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine that's out now that has finally arrived in Tennessee, it works differently. We get a very, very strong immune response with a single shot, in part because of the way that vaccine works. And in clinical studies, that vaccine was shown to provide protection against some of these variants. When the Moderna and Pfizer clinical studies were going on, these variants weren't in circulation.
Right.
When the J&J vaccine was being tested, they were. So the reasons we get two shots for one vaccine and one shot with another has a little to do with the technology that's being used to make those vaccines. But either way, they're all safe and working, and that's great.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about that technology in just a moment, because it's remarkable how that's been applied in this particular instance. But I guess sort of coming down at a personal level, if I'm given the choice between Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Moderna, should I just go for any one I can get, or is there a particular one? Should we wait to be selective about these kinds of things, or is the importance right now get inoculated and get the population really defensive against this?
Yeah, I mean, as an infectious disease physician who's been helping to care for patients sick from COVID-19, having effective and safe vaccines is so wonderful. And I really think get the one that's in front of you that you can get today. Yes, the two-dose vaccines require a little bit more of a personal investment. You have to get a shot twice. You have to remember to come back 3 or 4 weeks later to get that second shot. But that translates in good, strong immune protection. The single shot has the advantage of being a single shot. But so far of these three vaccines, they're all doing the job we need them to do. They're being safe and effective, and they're keeping people out of the hospital, and they're saving lives. So I absolutely would say get the vaccine you can get. It's also likely that to best reach everybody in the state and everybody in the country, the vaccines are going to be deployed to different clinics and different areas. And so it may be unlikely that you show up at a vaccine location and it turns into a fast food restaurant where you have a choice and say, oh, I'd like that one or that one. I think it will be more likely that you will have an opportunity to get immunized with a safe and effective vaccine and take that opportunity. I think it's really important that people know that these are all great choices.
Want to talk a little bit about the vaccine in general, and then also how that pertains to rollout. So typically, the sort of development cycle for a vaccine, it's multiple years. In this case, we've really seen a concentrated effort to get, again, here we are almost exactly a year from when coronavirus first landed in Tennessee, and we're already talking about multiple vaccines. How were we able to develop a vaccine in that short of a timeline and make sure that it's safe and effective?
Yeah, it's such a really good question. So it's important for us to understand that we entered this story kind of in the middle of an ongoing book about coronaviruses. So the COVID-19 pandemic arrived at a time when we had decades of research on coronaviruses. People like my colleague Mark Dennison at Vanderbilt have spent literally 3 decades trying to understand how these viruses work and what might be the best way to design a vaccine to prevent these viruses from causing infection. So we started this pandemic from a foundation of a lot of knowledge about these viruses. The other thing is that the technology that has been deployed for the vaccines is not new technology. The mRNA idea for vaccinating people has been an idea working its way towards clinical use also for decades. And this pandemic created the opportunity where it was clear that now was the time we needed to use this mRNA approach for the first time to see just how effective that it could be. Adenovirus vaccines, like the one that J&J used, have been developed before. So part of it is we started this pandemic from a position of knowledge. But the other thing that people need to understand is that the usual way that we develop a vaccine, which was also true in this case, is through a series of clinical studies that are small initially, where we give a vaccine or a new medication to a small group of relatively healthy people just to make sure that it's safe. That's called a phase 1 clinical trial. Then, if it passes through that, we go to a slightly larger study called a phase 2 study, where we start looking again at safety, but other markers that the vaccines might actually induce the right immune response. And then we go to these large clinical trials where we're actually trying to look at not only safety, but also efficacy to prevent the infection of interest. And that's called a phase 3 study. And traditionally, between each phase, we have to raise a bunch of money to be able to conduct a new trial, to manufacture the vaccine. We have to scramble to try to find people interested in conducting the trial. And we have to have enough of the disease of interest so that we can accomplish the endpoints of the trial in a relatively short period of time. And so typically, a phase 1 study may be successful, and it may wait many years before a phase 2 trial can start. When it came to COVID-19, there was no shortage of money. People wanted to invest in developing a vaccine against this pandemic, so raising capital wasn't a barrier. Finding people interested in participating in clinical studies of these vaccines was not a challenge, both for the study teams doing the work and people who wanted to be involved and volunteer themselves for these trials. There was no shortage of that.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate reality, of course, is that we had lots of disease in our communities to try to prevent, so the studies were able to hit their endpoints quickly. So all of that to say, we were able to go from no vaccine to some vaccines quickly, not because any steps were shortcutted, but rather that we were in a good position to move from phase to phase to phase as quickly as I think we've ever been able to do. And to me, that's a real testament to the power of science.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the most amazing things over the last year is really how science has been brought to the forefront. And from our standpoint, we're certainly hoping that that's a lasting impact of coronavirus in a very positive way, is that people do place great value in the field of science and what it can do to keep us personally safe, but also change the world in a lot of ways. So I certainly hope that that's a byproduct that continues forward from here. In terms of the vaccine, now that we have these vaccines that have been developed safely and are effective, we're starting to see the rollout happen, and that's a massive logistic undertaking to really accomplish, to get as many people vaccinated, and now we're trying to get, I guess, half of the population of the United States almost effectively vaccinated by the end of May. That's a pretty ambitious goal. We are hearing certainly of some cases where healthy people, getting the vaccine or having some adverse reactions. Do we have a good understanding of what's happening there, or are we still learning as the process unfolds?
Well, we've now vaccinated millions of people in the country, and it's really clear that these vaccines are safe and seem to be very effective. We're getting more information from other parts of the world that actually got the vaccines out quicker. Places like Israel, for example, where they're clearly showing real-world use is reducing hospitalizations, reducing deaths, reducing cases. In the U.S., the mRNA vaccines have proven to be very, very safe. What we saw early, which is still the case, is that about 1 in a million or so people who get immunized, maybe 2 out of a million, may have a severe allergic reaction. And that's why when we use the mRNA vaccines, we monitor people for at least 15 minutes to make sure that there's no untoward allergic reactions, which are treatable, by the way. But outside of that, they've continued to be really, really, really safe. And again, I'm delighted because the disease itself, COVID-19, has proven to be far from safe and unfortunately has cost millions of lives.
Yeah. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being like as giddy as a middle school student on the last day of school before summer, how optimistic are you that somewhere in 2021 we might kind of get back to a normal life and realizing that it may be a new normal, but a life where we can, to some extent, kind of take this a little bit out of our minds and focus on the things that we normally would want to focus on?
Yeah. Well, people who know me know I tend to be an optimist. I tend to be at that level of a middle schooler on the last day of school at base.
I live in that world.
Yeah, I sort of started at level 10. But when I think about where this pandemic started and how poorly I was able to predict its behavior, I need to forcefully temper my enthusiasm. And I would say I'm at about a 7 or so. We have the understanding and the tools in place to end this pandemic. And the question is, how quickly can we get there? And I just don't know, but I'm optimistic that we will get there by the end of this calendar year. But if you fast forwarded me to 2022 and it turned out we were still cleaning up some hot spots and still maybe wearing masks or so, I guess I'd say I'm not terribly surprised, just disappointed. I really hope we get there because we live in one of the best cities on the planet, and it's been so hard not to fully enjoy all that Nashville has to offer because of this confounded pandemic.
Right. Dave, thanks very much for being with us today. I really appreciate you being here. And thank you again for all the work that you're doing over at Vanderbilt to help us get this virus under control and hopefully put it beyond our minds so that we can get back to normal life.
Well, thank you very much. The Adventure Science Center is such a pearl of Nashville, and I'm looking forward to it being full again and having people here learning about the power of science, which they've gotten to see also with our response to the pandemic. And I really am appreciative that you do all that you do, and giving me the platform and the opportunity to talk to you today is a great honor. So thank you.
Yeah, very, very, very happy to have you. So hopefully we'll have you again soon.
Great.
Thanks, Dave.
You're welcome.